Welcome, I'm Giulia.
And I am Marta.
And this is LateMode, a podcast in search of the zeitgeist. Through a series of conversations, we explore the fragmented and hyper-connected modes of our current times. Hello, and welcome to LateMode. Today, I've invited Rosie Strickland to sit down and unravel the topic of dissociation. Rosie lives in London, where she's involved in a range of creative projects, from art direction to set design. In our chat, Rosie and I reflect upon her resignation from GreenPeaceUK while discussing the current state of environmental institutions and activism today. Through the conversation, we explore the different ways of becoming more sustainable as artists and creators, in a material, economical, and societal sense. I hope you will enjoy it.
Hi, Giulia.
Thank you for making time to have this chat today.
You're very welcome.
I just heard how busy and warm you have been there in London. So thank you for taking a little moment in your busy hot day. I have invited you today to talk about dissociation, which is actually the topic that Richard left us, our previous guest. And I thought it was kind of fitting quite nicely with what we discussed on our previous chat when I was in London. And I remember we talked about your work for Greenpeace. We also talked about this sort of institutional environment that you were working in and how does it relate to the individual. So maybe we should start by introducing yourself, and then you can take this topic kind of where you want.
Cool. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be here and to have a chat. And I think on the basis of our conversation early on, it just flowed so nicely. So I'm really glad to be here and talk a bit more in depth. I'm Rosie Strickland. I have a number of professional labels, if you like. So sometimes I'm an artist, sometimes I'm an art director, sometimes I'm a designer, a maker, an activist, a bunch of different labels that I can occupy professionally at any one time. Seeing as we're talking about Greenpeace, so I worked at GreenPeaceUK for about 4 years. After many years in the environmental movement in the UK, doing voluntary work in the environment and climate movement. And then I was lucky enough to have a job in-house at Greenpeace as a designer and art director, which was broadly, working on their direct action campaigns, as well as like social media content, raising awareness for their range of like campaigns to protect nature and stop climate change. But my time at Greenpeace actually came to an end in July 2020. And it wasn't a very, it was a bit of a bumpy ride leaving Greenpeace because I don't know what the organization was very kind of like what I would say is very stagnated. And I'm the kind of person, like I'm a creative person. I like to be busy. I like to be busy. I like to have lots to think about and lots to do. But for a really long time, my role had become completely like boring, basically.
I really liked how you phrased it in our first meeting. You were bored out of Greenpeace. I think that's really funny.
I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about it, isn't it? Because it's like, we live in a time where we have to be acting now to protect and save the environment. There's devastation around the whole world based on, because of fossil fuels, because of immense amounts of like plastic consumption, etc., transport, etc. So like the fact that I can have had this experience at Greenpeace where I was working there for 4 years and eventually bored out, like that's what I came across that term, reading on the internet as we do, and it just resonated. I was just like, that's what was going wrong. That's what was up. Like for me, I wasn't fulfilled in the role. I wasn't being given briefs, like creative briefs that excited me.
This was on a personal level, or do you think that this is more part of how the institution of Greenpeace is overall? Did you also experience maybe with some of your colleagues or other people that were also working there? Were they sharing the same feelings?
Yeah, definitely. Particularly in the team that I was in, there were a lot of shared feelings about just no real creative ambition, basically. Like as a part of a team of designers, and I think we were all feeling very frustrated in our role, actually. And so the dissociation, so a lot of people will come to a job like Greenpeace. I think dissociation is a really great word, actually, and I've been thinking about it a lot, and I think it's really nice to talk about it in relation to my experience at Greenpeace, because back in its roots, Greenpeace was essentially a group of activists that came together with a shared passion and an immense amount of integrity, and took some huge risks and changed the world as a result of doing so. If you don't know Greenpeace, they moved into the biodiversity campaigning space, a lot of campaigning at sea. They played a huge role in banning whaling and protecting all different species at sea. So, huge history, being an organisation with integrity and a lot of people who really walk the talk. It's really strange. So I kind of hero worshipped Greenpeace in a way. So I had this kind of like, oh my God, they're amazing, like this total dream job. And I worked really hard to get it as well. I had 3 different opportunities to interview, and I got the third one. I remember writing my applications, and when you really, really want a job and you send it to pretty much everyone and say, please proofread my application, and like, it was mad, and I wanted it so bad. And then I got it, and I was just like, it's so exciting. It was great. It's funny thinking back, because even within the first month or so when I was there, I remember feeling a kind of sense of dissociation, actually. Like, this isn't right. Like, what I'm experiencing here isn't quite right.
Since the first month you were working there?
Yeah. At the time, I put it down to a kind of like being a newbie in the organisation, getting to know how things are done, getting to know people. But as time moved on, I kind of realised that those first impressions were actually really right. Like, my first impressions of it being a little bit like wrong, wrong for me, and not in line with like what I would expect an organisation like that to be doing.
And so, why was that? What were the things that made it wrong?
I don't think they really knew what they were doing. And I think I wanted them to be the experts, but they weren't. And there was a lot of internal politics. So it wasn't a very kind of collegiate atmosphere. It was quite competitive. I remember joining and feeling kind of like, yay, I'm part of this amazing organisation. But it wasn't very welcoming, actually. It wasn't even very friendly. Like, there was a lot of really surface bullshit, actually, which now I can call it absolute bullshit, because I'm not in the corporate charity sector anymore. I'm like freelancing in the arts. And when I look back at those times, and I'm like, oh my God, those cheesy moments when your boss buys you a shit cake and we all sit around wearing party hats being like, happy birthday to you. And it's just like, it's just so gross in this like soulless boardroom, and I was just like, whoa, it was super cold, actually. And I think if you come from maybe a more corporate environment, then you go to Greenpeace, and because they've got plants in their office, everyone's like, oh, this is so nice. This is such a lovely office. This is such a nice atmosphere. But actually, it's still just an office, and it's still full of these really weird, awkward, like office behaviors.
This is definitely an interesting point, with this topic of dissociation. As you're describing, basically, there is this idea of what activism can be or could be like. And then there is the practice of how it plays out within this institution. In particular, right now, we're talking about Greenpeace, and I don't know, maybe there are other examples of things working better, even in offices. And this is also what I experience nowadays when I think about activism. I see this ideology, so this like idea of what things should be done and how to do them. But then really the practice of it, it's like so far away from that ideal form. And I think this can also scare people actually doing something about what they care.
Yeah, I think it's really good to talk about violence in protest. And one of the foundational elements of so much change over history has been through following the principles of non-violence. And I think there's a huge conversation there about non-violence and like whether damage to property is violent. This is like also really important when we talk about harm as well. And I think harm, interpersonal harm within these organizations. So if we look through a lens of like intersectionality as well, and we start to look at these environments that are actually very much geared towards privileging the opinions and the voices of a certain group of society, which is basically how we've all been like molded through growing up in our culture, basically. It's about how we make those parts of ourselves conscious in order to change them. On the base level, like you've got a very organic protest, which is essentially a riot, where like a group of people who are experiencing some form of injustice usually rise up together and create a form of civil disobedience in the form of a riot, which normally ends up in some damaged property and some targeted assaults, usually just on property, with a message. So that is very like, there's nothing organised about that. And I think environmental activism in the UK and possibly across Europe, there tends to be a real focus on facts and figures and this quite cold approach to rationalising, like reasoning why we need to protect nature. You know, like parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Fine, I think that it had its moment, that kind of like phrase, but
it removes us from nature. Having this super rational approach is necessary to think about those things, but also in the like if it's too rational, I get the feeling that it's okay, but we're also part of nature. Yeah, I think that's a really great point. How this actually plays out on the individual. Also, how do we relate then to nature? Do we feel part of it?
yeah. And I think a lot of people come to environmentalism through their emotions. You know, they become afraid, they are worried for their family, for their friends, for their loved ones, for nature, for the species that they love. So they come to it from a really emotional level. And then literally the environmental movement in the UK just spurts out facts and figures. Like that's the only way that anyone's ever going to understand why nature is important. I feel like it really misses a trick there. And
yeah, I was thinking in relation to what you were saying just before. We were talking about, this dissociation maybe from being part of nature or being not part of nature on an individual level, and how does this relate to, for example, activism. And I wanted to connect this to also what you were mentioning before, saying that now you are freelancing in the creative industry. And I think this is an interesting position that you're in, because you experienced this ideology through an institution, and now you're basically free to explore this topic by yourself. And yeah, I'm curious to think, how do you see this? Like, how do you see it different now that you're on your own, let's say? Do you still need the label, for example, I'm focused on sustainability, or I'm focused on ecology, or I'm focused on climate activism? Or is that something that you inherently have with you?
I think like for years I called myself, or I was considered an environmentalist, but I have become really disillusioned with what that even means. Like from my experience working at Greenpeace was such a hostile environment for me. I just don't even want to associate myself with anything that they do. I mean, they do a few good things, but I think in terms of having a very institutionalized experience of trying to defend and protect nature, I feel like I'm dissociated from that whole movement. And it's so dominant, that whole kind of space of who gets to be a climate activist, who gets to be in the environmental movement, I think is such a toxic thing. And it's so pervasive in this country. Like it's completely not inclusive. It's completely not diverse. But you've got all of these white people of a certain age and a certain demographic at the top who say that it's inclusive and diverse just because they think it is, or whatever, because they've got their own dissociation, I guess, of the work that they need to do. They don't see, they're blinded, they're completely blinkered. Anyway, now working in the creative industry, I'm really shocked how little people are doing for the environment, having come from intensive sustainability procurement, so working in print production, materials production, and like looking at everything from paint to textiles to paper, and looking at supply chains for all of those things when I'm designing and making stuff, like those are really important considerations. But now I'm working on projects where they hardly think about it and they hardly talk about it, and these are like people who I consider sound normal. They're not like people who are sitting in boardrooms being like, let's burn loads of fossil fuels. They're just ordinary people getting on with their jobs, being like, we need to make something, we need to make a living. But there's absolutely no conversation about the environment anywhere.
And so, how do you see the future? I mean, how do we become less dissociated from this place where we live in? Like, how do you see it happening? Or if you would have your own ideal way to make activism, for example, how would you have it?
I think what has to happen first is a political awareness, a political understanding. Essentially, the politics and who's in government is one of the main things that impacts us and the environment. So we currently don't have a political system that is geared towards any kind of like green thinking. You know, we hardly have any green MPs in this country. I think we have one. You know, Germany have more. But like, it should be at the front of our thinking, but it's really, really not. And then instead we have this like ultra neoliberal approach and this sort of like the conscious community, whatever that means, you know, we're all conscious, this kind of weird new elitism, which is like people who meditate and do yoga and think that they're going to change the world by drinking herbal tea. I know that's a bit bitchy, but like, it's not going to happen. Yes, look after yourself by doing yoga and doing the meditation and drinking good herbs and things like that. But how we're going to make the world a better place for everyone and for nature is by engaging in the political system. We have to lobby, we have to vote, we have to be out on the streets campaigning, we have to elect in the right representatives. And fundamentally, I think we also probably have to change the way we do politics to incorporate nature as a voice within that space. I think it feels very radical to even say something like that, but that is the direction we have to go. Because at the moment, the way that politics thinks about nature is completely economical. You know, it's about how much is that land worth and how much money can I make from that land through mining, through extraction, through buildings, through agriculture. It's all economics. And like, we're not looking at the kind of health of the planet as a cohesive whole. And until our political system has those laws, essentially, until we as a population can create those laws that give nature a voice within our political system, everything we do is like, I don't know, I can't think of a good metaphor, but it's not pointless, but it's a very, very slow process.
No, I think that this goes back again to what we've just been discussing throughout, is that we cannot remove ourselves from it. And I think being part of the sort of process of putting ourselves back with nature, because we're like already with it, but this sort of like we have this feeling that we're somewhat like removed from it. It means that we also have to look at how did we structure ourselves at the beginning? Like, how did we make our own political systems work? And is there something that we can change there, that precisely what you're saying, that takes into consideration the planet as a whole, not just us humans? And I mean, I really hope that this will happen. I think there's a lot of people who are wanting this change. I'm always on the sort of optimistic side of things. Maybe I'm a bit naive. But I think also it's important to talk about the people who want the change, the people who are actually doing something to change something. And that's without, I'm doing yoga and drinking tea, therefore the world will be a better place. But there are people actually studying and creating, like there's a lot of creative work out there that tries to tell a message. Actually, I find interesting what you said before about creative practices and creative businesses not taking these environmental choices into consideration, because that's hard. Like a lot of art practice actually uses materials, and those choices at some point, I mean, even myself, when I take photos and buy films, and I have these millions like film canisters at home, and I sometimes wonder, is this actually good? then of course you try to find a million different things to do with those canisters. But I think that's an interesting point. How do you select those materials? How do you work with something that requires something that is supposedly bad for the environment? I don't know, because you do a lot of set design as well. So I guess you're also confronted with those choices.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when I'm doing, my own making, I definitely always source my materials sustainably and ethically, without a doubt, wherever I can. I think we have to understand that there are restrictions. We have limitations by the system around us. This is also a thing as well, which we can get locked in this thinking of like, oh, I need to create a zero carbon artwork or something like that, or like build a carbon negative house. And it's kind of fine to think like that, but I feel like it's a bit restrictive, because again, it puts the weight of the action on our shoulders as an individual, like it's the choices that I make that are going to make an impact. Whereas actually it's not really the choices that you make that are going to make an impact. It's the decisions of institutions like big multinational companies that are going to make the biggest impact. And how we influence them is usually through a political avenue. I think as artists as well, it's really important to look at our practice in the space of the wider system. One of my favorite ways to describe a good piece of art is the use of the word an intervention, because I always want to look at how an artwork intervenes in a system. And the system could be like a way of thinking. So it slightly shifts or changes or opens up a way of thinking. Or it actually interrupts or intersects or somehow challenges an actual system, like creates a new material intervention or a new form that challenges our perception in some way. I like art that looks at systems and looks at how we are influenced by and can influence systems.
Yeah, I think this is somewhat connected again to this dissociation. I also appreciate works that can create this kind of separate feeling. So you place it there and then it takes you somewhere else that makes you think not in a very linear way. In this case, if it would be something to do with climate change, it would take you there, but it wouldn't just scream it at you, basically. And I think that's also the risk that we take sometimes when, you just create on a brief. And it's like, oh, now I'm going to create something about climate change. And then it really just is too straightforward. It's just too much there that then people are sort of scared. They're like, oh, okay, if I'm looking at this now, I have to feel guilt and I have to feel something is really bad. And I'm not saying that this is not also necessary sometimes, but maybe it's not relatable for the majority of people, I would say.
But I'm not sure that art necessarily has to be relatable for the majority of people. I think art has, it occupies a space where we can experiment with materials. So it has a material component, and it has a, aesthetic component. And then it has a kind of philosophical component and probably many, many, many other components that I can't think about right now. But I guess if you think about like on the sort of scale of what is a climate artwork, then on the one hand, you've got a sculpture made from recycled waste, for example, which we have seen so many of those. Okay, like to make a chandelier from milk bottle tops, that's kind of been done, or to make any kind of sculpture that's from waste material. Like we're not really providing any sort of intervention or solution there. It's just the sort of like, oh, here's some waste, let's make something pretty out of it. And then on the other scale of things, you've got artists who are not even really making anything materially, but they're talking about things, like Gentle Radical in South Wales. They won the Turner Prize last year, and part of their practice is literally just coming together as a community and talking about stuff, talking about the challenges of our time. They don't even come up with or propose to come up with solutions. The whole point of what they do is to bring people together and deal with these challenges, to try and deal with these challenges. And I just love that. I think that's amazing. And really, I think how we approach like these massive issues as artists is really critical and important. And it's up to the individual or the collective how we approach that. And there's, countless ways in which you can approach these big questions. I think one challenge, of course, is again back to from the individual, practitioner to the institution. And certainly in the UK, the main way that we can make art is through the support of an institution. And there have been a few mainstream charities and institutions that have engaged with artists and commissioned artists to make great work. But whenever you engage with an institution, you also end up, engaging a whole load of people who are going to want you to do something for them. For example, if you work in film, undoubtedly they're going to want a film that says their message. They're not going to let the artist do what they want unless they are really good at working with a commissioning artist. So you've already got like a whole bunch of people who are going to kind of try and direct your work, which is inherently frustrating as an artist. So that's for non-arts organisations. And then you've got like the arts organisations who, because the arts is woefully underfunded in this country, you then get the big arts organisations needing to do a whole load of community audience development work because they need to like reach out to new audiences in order to bring in more money. So then they'll commission an artist, or they'll have an artist residency, and then they'll have this huge part which is like, you must also facilitate 3 community engagement workshops as part of your residency program. And it's like, well, but I'm not a community facilitator. Like, I'm not, do you know what I mean? Like, unless community is a really big part of your work and practice as an artist, like you actively work with people to make your work, then fantastic. But it shouldn't be the core or like even a part of every artist bloody commission at the moment. And it's just lazy, in my opinion. And it just smacks of the arts being a little bit stuck, not having enough money because we've got a Conservative government, and then also just not really being able to shake up their institutions enough to be able to reach out to new audiences.
Putting too much pressure on the individual artists that basically should create and then should also, be their own manager. They should also know how they're going to pay rent at the end of the month. And then also do the work which I think should be done maybe in connection with maybe social researchers who can help to figure out how a work of art or a creative project can be best incorporated in the community, or if that community actually needs that, or maybe they need something different that, can be creatively thought of together with artists who want to explore that topic.
Exactly, yeah.
I mean, part of the reason why this podcast exists to begin with was really precisely this, like what you're describing. Firstly, this desire to sort of talk to people and to talk about what is going on right now. How are people thinking about these random topics that we get every 2 weeks? And also, there is not that many free spaces to do that, Like, you have to create them for yourself because it feels that everything sort of has this structure already put in this sort of expectations. So we make this podcast, both me and Marta, because we want to. There is no other, no one is expecting us to do anything. So we're like free to talk to who we want, to say what we want. And also you, the guests, are free in the same way, of course, within the sort of framework of being respectful to this space. But yeah, so I'm definitely a big fan of making your own free spaces around.
I think it's really important. It's good to make the free spaces, and I think some of the best projects come from when you've got time and energy and the resources to create those spaces and curate them and create them in the way that you want is great. But I think the older you get and the more time you spend working as an artist, the more you realise how much economics is involved, and you have to be a little bit business minded, which sounds awful because it's not inherently a sort of like capital commercial thing, but like
you have to live.
You have to live, exactly, and you have to be really super boundaried about how much you give away, actually, like in any kind of conversation, because your intellectual property as an artist is so important. And just having a conversation with someone, they will ask you questions, and when you're an artist you kind of like live and breathe your work, so actually the sense of dissociation when you are a practicing artist is quite low because it's so much part of your life. Like, I find, for me anyway, like being an artist is just part and parcel of who I am. So when I have conversations with people, I can just push their thinking somehow, or like bring in ideas or support creative thinking in a group almost by accident, And I think it's those kind of moments where it's just like, oh, okay, I need to like somehow make sure that I'm not giving loads of stuff away for free because I still need to pay my bills. And it's like, yeah.
Yeah, I understand it. It's a struggle of all of my artist friends as well. I see it that whatever it is that you accidentally might give out, I just hope that it sort of just comes back. But then again, I'm just like an optimist again. So I'm just like, yeah, there will be some karma, coming back my way. Then I will probably get inspired in the next conversation that I'm going to have with some random person, maybe on this podcast.
I hope so. I hope it will. I think maybe I'm just a bit overworked at the moment, so yeah.
Maybe you're experiencing really this dissociation now. Like you're maybe feeling a bit removed from what you're doing because you at some point you have to, right? We almost like feel ashamed to talk about this as artists or creative people, but like the reality of what it means to deal with financial insecurity and stress every month because of this, and trying to maintain this balance of I want to create and I want to, and then at the same time feeling this guilt is, oh, I shouldn't talk about this because this kind of diminishes my creative genius or something if I talk about money or if I talk about rent. But I mean, that is a reality, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's awful because I think we have to be really on top of that, of our own accounting, essentially, because, I hear people who are makers and artists and craftspeople, they'll spend days and days like working on something just in their own time and not being paid for it. But I'm like, I won't make any work unless I have a commission. Okay, I'm thinking and reading and exploring ideas all the time, like everyone does. But like, I'm at a stage now where like, I actually can't afford to do any kind of work for free. I know that I'm also at a stage in my career where like, I don't need to do work for free. I can and should be paid for my work. And I think anyone who expects artists to work for free, I just don't have any time for them anymore. It's creativity and health are often the first things that people expect to get for free. And those are some of the most crucial parts of making anything good. Like a good product, a good brief, a good project, whatever. It's always how creative is it, or and how like healthy is it in a broader scheme of things. Big questions, but I think fundamentally making a living as an artist is really challenging, and I think you just have to not give yourselves away for free and like put yourself out there, meet people. Like most of the gigs that I've ever got have been through contacts, through friends, through networks, through my name being visible in places. That's like the most important thing, I think, because there are these big institutions that are like Greenpeace, like the big arts institutions that really aren't your friend, actually. They might seem friendly and good places, but they want you to work for free, without a doubt. They will all want you to work for free. They will all want you to do extra things on top of just being an artist and working and creating, a brilliant piece of work. So there's like a whole bunch of like these big institutions that might seem good on the face of it, but actually are really, really not. They're really awful. And then anyway.
Okay, well, I don't know if you wanted to add something about this topic of dissociation, what came to mind. We have discussed quite a lot of it, but if there was something you would like to add on it.
Cool. Okay. So some final thoughts. I guess just to return to what we do as artists when we're confronted with these big questions about how to change the world, basically. These big overwhelming questions, and we invite ourselves to consider how to approach these things within our practice. And materiality is obviously really important. Like, how can we really expand what materials we use in order to be less harmful or completely harmless to people and environment? And then it's also where we position our work inside or outside institutions. And I think because I've done a lot of work in public space with Greenpeace, actually designing interventions in an illegal capacity, I feel very strongly that actually positioning art in a space that is completely public and not confined to the white cube of a gallery is really important. And whether that public space is a visible space or a media space, or whether it's a systemic space, I think is really important. but looking at our work less through a commercial product lens. How do we actually look at our work as a way to critique the systems and processes and ideologies of wider society? And where we position that work has to be a fundamental consideration within our practice. And finding a way, a non-commercial way to sustain our practices, being a business person in a way, but not in a creating a product to sell to market, but a business person in the sense of networking, putting yourself into spaces, going to the openings, meeting people, taking people for coffees and teas whose work resonates with you, putting your name in places where it's going to be seen and recognized, and then finding an economic foundation that you can survive on, that then enables you to make your fantastic work. Just getting yourself economically sorted, which gives the space to create great work.
Yeah, essentially what you just listed, going back to this dissociation topic, is how to not dissociate yourself from what you're doing. You know, if you are creating art and then you put it in this gallery, like in this white space there that only a few people will actually go to experience, to me is a way that you sort of disengage from the materiality of it, the sort of environment that this piece is created in. But I definitely agree with what you're saying on finding ways to make your own practice sustainable, which means also sustainable for you, which means economically sustainable, and then actually to be able to experience the freedom to explore what you want, because then it's not dependent on institutional frameworks. And yeah, I really hope to see more and more of this happening.
Yeah, I think what you said about being dissociated from your work, society and the big institutions will try to devalue your work as an artist. They'll want you to do stuff for free. Noticing your intellectual property, if you like, and all of these terms are so capitalistic. I feel I'm almost like embarrassed using them, but I think it's really important to notice when you are in a space and potentially people might expect you to do some work for free. Okay, it's good to go into spaces and have great inspiring conversations with people, but at the end of the day, make sure that you also value yourself, you know, like put a value on your work, put a value on not just a product like a piece of art, but you and your time, because the rest of the world will try and get you to work for free. It's up to you to be able to value your time and to get people to pay you for your artistic labor, the way that you think, the way that you make, your creative thinking. All of these are so valued by so many different institutions. You know, they really need that kind of stuff, which if we do that as a collective endeavor, like artists across Europe, then slowly we can improve the conditions for everyone working in the creative industry. So, yay.
Yay! Hey, I just want to ask you one last thing. As you know, we end the episodes by asking each guest to take a ruin out of a conversation, we call it. Essentially a topic that you want to suggest our next guest to explore. So it can be something that you personally want to hear about. It can be something that comes out of this conversation. So yeah, go as wild as you want.
I think economics comes to mind. It has to be economy, not the economy, because I hate that, but it has to be economy because I think that it has layers of meaning, and I think that could be really interesting. Yeah, cool.
Yeah, an economy is precisely a system, right? To me, when I hear just economy, not the economy, I think of systems and sort of connections. And yeah, it's very interesting how we got from dissociation to economy, right? Because it's kind of like a dissociation, like you feel separate from something. And then at the end, through this talk, we got to think of a system, actually. I think it's a nice way to round this lovely chat up. So, yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed it. I think we covered a lot of ground.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me. I can't wait to hear the next episodes. Ciao. Thanks, Giulia.
Thank you so much for staying with us until the end. If you want to dive deeper into the show, don't forget to check the podcast description for extra resources, contact information, and a sign-up form for our newsletter. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and until next time, take care.